I asked another Amish wife what happened on her wedding night. We were both punished. The lye soap is still wet on my hands when Sarah says it. We're at the wash basin behind her mother's house, and the water is so cold my knuckles have gone the color of skim milk. There's a wren screaming in the maple tree. I remember that. The wren, and the smell of wood smoke from somebody's chimney 2 farms over, and the way Sarah's prayer cap had come loose on one side because she'd been bending over the washboard too long. I ask her, quiet, almost not out loud, "Sarah, what happened? On your wedding night?" She doesn't look up. Her hands keep moving in the water, and then she says, "I thought he was killing me. I thought that's what marriage was. I waited for it to be over for 4 years. 4 years. That's the part that, sorry. Give me a second. I was 22. She was 26. We'd both been wives long enough to know better than to ask, and we'd asked anyway, and somebody had heard us through the kitchen window. I didn't know that yet. I wouldn't know for 3 more days. But the bishop's wife was already walking back down the lane, and by Sunday, Sarah and I would both be sitting on separate benches with our heads down while the men decided what to do with women who talked. Quick pause. My name is Rebecca, and this is Rebecca Amish Home. If these stories stay with you, if they make you feel less alone, subscribe. It's free, and it's the reason I can keep telling them. Tell me in the comments, was there ever a question you weren't allowed to ask out loud? And who would you have asked if you could? And if you want to go further, a super chat or a membership, that's you telling me these voices are worth hearing. That keeps this going. Now back to what happened. In our community, and I'll say our, even though I left, because some things don't leave you, there's a rule that doesn't have a name. Nobody ever sat me down and said it. Nobody had to. The rule is, a wife's body belongs to her husband, and a husband's body belongs to God, and a woman's questions belong nowhere. The root of it goes back hundreds of years, to the Ordnung and the verses our ministers read every other Sunday, the ones about submission, about the woman being the glory of the man. But here's the part that knocked the wind out of me later. In all those readings, in all those years, I never once heard a minister say the word consent. Not once. Not in English. Not in Pennsylvania Dutch. The word simply did not exist in the rooms where my life was being decided. And you learn a rule like that without anyone teaching it. You learn it when your Aunt Mary stops singing mid-hymn because her husband walked into the room. You learn it when the older girls go quiet at quilting bees the moment a married woman says the word bed. You learn it from the way your mother's shoulders drop half an inch when your father comes home from the field, not in fear exactly, but in a kind of bracing. When I was 13, I asked my older sister Lydia why Mama looked tired all the time, and Lydia just said, "She's married, Becca." That was the whole answer. I almost asked what that meant. I almost did. But Lydia was already turning back to the snap peas, and I just knew that I had walked up to a door I wasn't supposed to open. So I closed it, and I carried that. I met Daniel at a Sunday singing when I was 19. He was the boy who didn't sing loud. He had a small scar on his bottom lip from where a calf had kicked him when he was 8, and he kept touching it when he was nervous, which was always, we courted for 14 months. He brought me a pine cone once, just a pine cone, because he said he liked the shape of it and thought I might too. I still have it. It's in a drawer in my apartment in Lancaster, 3 states away from the farm where he gave it to me. 3 weeks before the wedding, my mother pulled me into the pantry and said this exactly: "Be obedient. It will hurt. Then it will be over." 10 words. I counted them later, lying in bed. 10 words for the rest of my life. Daniel knew less than I did. I want you to understand that, because it matters. His father had died when he was 11, and the uncle who raised him was the kind of man who'd rather chop wood in a thunderstorm than say a word about anything tender. So Daniel came to our wedding night the way I did, with nothing, with less than nothing, with a head full of Bible verses about being one flesh and a body that had never been told what that meant. I think it was a Thursday. No, wait, Friday. It was a Friday, because I remember the bread for the next day's breakfast was already wrapped in the blue towel on the counter. Funny what your brain saves. The women came the day before the wedding to help with the cooking, and I kept waiting. I kept waiting for one of them, any of them, to take me aside. My grandmother, my aunt, Daniel's mother, anyone. I kept finding excuses to be alone in rooms, drying the same plate twice, so that if somebody wanted to say something, The door was open. Nobody walked through it. The closest anyone came was Daniel's mother, who squeezed my hand at the back porch and said, "He's a good boy. Be patient with him." And I nodded like I understood. I didn't understand. That's the thing nobody tells you sometimes. The silence is the loudest preparation of all. The room we slept in that night was the upstairs bedroom of his uncle's farmhouse, the one with the slanted ceiling and the window that wouldn't quite latch. There was a kerosene lamp on the dresser, turned low, because Daniel had read somewhere that brides preferred the dark. The quilt was a double wedding ring pattern, white and pale blue, made by his grandmother. I knew because she'd told me at the wedding, twice, with her hand on my wrist. It was October. I could hear the cows shifting in the barn through the floorboards. I was wearing a long white cotton nightgown that buttoned to my throat, and my hair was still half pinned because my fingers had gone stupid trying to take it down. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed in his black trousers and a white shirt, and he kept pulling at the seam of his left sleeve, over and over, like he was trying to unstitch himself. He said, "Rebecca," just my name, and then he didn't say anything else for what felt like an hour but was probably 1 minute. I sat down next to him because I didn't know what else to do. Our knees touched and we both flinched, like we'd been burned. He said, Do you know what we're supposed to?" And he couldn't finish the sentence. I shook my head. He laughed. This small, awful laugh. Not because anything was funny, but because his body didn't know what else to do with itself. I felt my toes curl inside the wool socks I'd forgotten to take off. I pressed my tongue against the roof of my mouth so hard I tasted blood. He moved. I stopped breathing. What happened next? I'm not going to walk you through, because it isn't yours, and it isn't anyone's, but I will tell you the truth of it, which is that it was clumsy, and it was painful, and neither of us spoke. He said, "I'm sorry." Twice. Once in the middle, once at the end. I said nothing, because my mother had told me to be obedient, and obedient women in our community don't speak. My jaw was so tight I had a headache for 2 days afterward. My hands were fists. And there was a moment, this is the part I still can't quite hold, where I wanted to push him off and pull him closer at the exact same time. Because he was the only person in the world who was in that room with me, and he was also the reason I was in that room at all. When it was over, he turned away from me and faced the wall. I didn't cry. I couldn't. I just lay there and looked at the ceiling and counted the knots in the wood beams. 17 knots. I noticed the quilt had a loose thread near my left hip. I pulled it. I kept pulling it. The thread came out longer and longer until it was the length of my forearm, and I held it in my fingers and thought, this is my wedding night, and I am unraveling a quilt his grandmother spent the winter sewing. Daniel's breathing changed. I think he was crying, but quietly, the way men in our community cry, which is barely at all. We did not touch each other again until morning. The lamp burned out around 3. I watched it go. Here is the plain fact of it. Neither of us knew what was supposed to happen. Not really. He didn't know a woman's body could feel anything but pain on a wedding night. I didn't know either. We had been raised in a place where the entire architecture of intimacy had been kept from us on purpose, because the people raising us believed that ignorance was the same thing as purity. They believed that if they told us nothing, we would arrive at our wedding nights clean. What we arrived as, instead, was frightened. And the frightening of 2 children, and calling it holy, is I'm sorry. I have to stop for a second. There's a word for what that is, and I didn't have it then. Daniel wasn't trying to hurt me. That's what makes it worse. He was doing what he had been told was his duty, in the only way he knew how, with a body that had never been spoken to honestly about itself in 23 years. No, 24. He was 24. I always get that wrong, and the silence around us wasn't an accident. It wasn't that nobody had gotten around to telling us. It was that the not telling was the whole point. The not telling was how the community kept its girls obedient, and its boys ashamed, and its marriages quiet. Later, much later, I would learn there is a word called arousal, and a word called consent, and a whole map of a woman's body that I had lived inside for 2 decades without ever being shown. I learned those words at 28. I had been married for 6 years, and I sat on the floor of a public library and put my forehead on my knees and grieved for the girl who hadn't known any of it. I didn't grieve her right away, though. First I lived. I learned to leave my body when Daniel reached for me. I would pick a spot on the ceiling, usually a water stain shaped like the state of Ohio, in the corner above the dresser, and I would put myself there until he was finished. By the time we'd been married a year, I could do it in under 10 seconds. That's a skill, you know. Nobody hands you a ribbon for it. By the time we'd been married 3 years, I had a whole system. Tuesdays and Saturdays were the nights, because those were the nights he'd been raised to believe were appropriate. Don't ask me why. I would make sure to be very tired on those nights. I would start the dishes late. I would offer to read to him from scripture until his eyes closed. And on the nights when none of that worked, I would go to the water stain in Ohio, and I would wait. I thought I was the only one. Turns out that's the community's best-selling lie. It was a Tuesday in April when Sarah and I were hanging sheets on her mother's line, and the wind kept whipping them up around us like we were inside a tent. And that's when she said it, not the words from the wash basin. Those came later, but the first crack. She said, "Becca, do you ever just count?" And I said, "Count what?" And she said, "Anything. The boards on the ceiling. The seconds." And I felt my whole stomach drop into my shoes. I said, 17 knots. She said, 22 pine boards. We didn't say another word about it for 6 months. But we knew. We both knew. And I watched her face after she said it. The way she looked back at the basket of clothespins like she was afraid she'd just stepped off a cliff. Then there was Mary Daniel's cousin Mary, who I'd grown up with, who got married a year after I did to a man named Eli, who was kind in public and a stranger in his own bedroom. Mary almost told me once. We were canning peaches in August, and her hands were sticky to the wrist, and she said, "Becca, can I ask you?" And then her mother-in-law walked in carrying more jars. And Mary's face closed up like a barn door at sundown. She finished her sentence as, "Can I ask you to pass the cinnamon?" We canned 46 jars that day. I counted. 2 years later, Mary's older sister Anna told me Mary had asked the bishop's wife a question about her marriage, and the bishop's wife had told the bishop, and Mary had been told to fast for 3 days and pray for a more submissive spirit. Mary fasted. Mary prayed. Mary never asked anyone anything again. That's how the silence protects itself, not by punishing the question, but by making sure the next woman watches what happens to the one who asked. 4 months after Sarah and I asked each other the wrong question at the wash basin, the bishop's wife came to my door. I was kneading bread. I remember because I had to wipe my hands on my apron 3 times before I could open the latch, and the dough stuck to my knuckles in little white moons. She didn't come inside. She stood on the porch and she said, gently, that's the part that still gets me. She was gentle. "Rebecca, a good wife doesn't trouble her sister with questions she should be bringing to the Lord." That was all. She left a small loaf of her own bread on the railing and walked back down to her buggy. And I stood there with the dough on my hands, and I understood that I had been watched, and that Sarah had been watched, and that this was the punishment, not a beating, not a shunning, just the soft and absolute closing of every door I might have walked through. Sarah and I did not speak alone again for 2 years. I was 28 when I left. I won't go into all of it now, that's another story. And I'll tell it when I'm ready, but I will tell you about the library. There's a public library in Lancaster with green carpet and a smell like old paper and pencil shavings. And I walked in one Wednesday afternoon wearing English clothes that didn't fit right yet. And I sat down at a computer I didn't know how to use. And I typed 3 words into the search bar. What is consent? That was it. 3 words. I didn't even know if I was spelling it right. And the screen filled up with diagrams and definitions and articles, and there was a sentence on the first page. I clicked, I can still see it. The font was blue that said, "Consent must be informed, freely given, and able to be withdrawn at any time." I read it 4 times. Then I read it again. Informed. I had not been informed of anything. Freely given. I had been told to be obedient. Able to be withdrawn. I had not known withdrawal was a thing a woman was allowed to do. I put my forehead down on the desk, and the wood was cool, and the librarian must have seen me, but she didn't say anything. God bless her. She just slid a box of tissues across the table without looking up. I wasn't angry. That's the strange part. I was just sad. Devastatingly sad. For the girl who had counted 17 knots. For the girl who had unraveled a quilt. For Daniel, too, and this is the hard part for Daniel, who had been 24 and frightened, and had never been told that his wife was a person with her own body. because nobody had ever told him his body was a person's either. We were both prisoners. We were both children. And I carried that. I tried to tell my friend Hannah about it once. A year after I left, Hannah was English, born and raised, and the kindest woman I'd ever met. We were drinking coffee at her kitchen table, and I told her, as plainly as I could, what my wedding night had been. And Hannah said, "Oh my God, Becca, that's assault." And I flinched, not because she was wrong, because she was using a word that did not fit the shape of what had happened. Daniel had not assaulted me. Daniel had loved me the only way he had been taught. The word assault did not have room in it for his fear, for his shaking hands, for the way he'd said "I'm sorry" twice into the dark. There is no word in English for what happened to us, because English was written by people who assumed the basic facts of bodies were known. And I sat at Hannah's table and realized that I would spend the rest of my life living between two languages, one that had hurt me and one that couldn't hold what the hurt actually was. But here is the truth I won't lie about. I miss it. I miss the sound of horses at dawn, the soft, heavy clop of them on the lane before the sun was even up, before anyone was awake to need anything from me. I miss the smell of bread coming out of my mother's wood oven, that dense yeasted sweetness you cannot buy in any store, no matter what they tell you. And I miss the way my grandmother's hands looked when she was praying, folded in her lap, the knuckles swollen with 70 years of work, the gold of her wedding band almost worn through. Those things were real. They were mine. They are still mine. I am homesick for a place that hurt me, and I have stopped trying to make that make sense to anyone who hasn't lived it. What happened to me, what happened to Sarah, to Mary, to every woman who counted ceiling boards on her wedding night, it has a name now, and the name is silence dressed up as holiness. That's all it was. Not faith, not God, not the Ordnung, just silence, given a bonnet and a Bible and called sacred. And I want to say this carefully, because beauty and harm can live in the same house, and the house I grew up in had both. I am not building a life that rejects everything I came from. I am building a life that chooses. I bake bread on Sundays. I pray, sometimes, in the language I was raised in. I light a candle for Daniel on his birthday, because he is still there, and I hope someone is being kind to him. That is the most I can do. That is enough. If you grew up somewhere your own body was kept from you like something dangerous, somewhere the questions you needed to ask were the questions you were punished for asking, I see you. You survived something, and surviving is enough. You are not broken. You were never broken. You were a child in a room with no light, and you found the door anyway, and that is not a small thing. That is the whole thing. To the woman still inside, washing dishes tonight while she counts the boards on the ceiling, I see you. To the woman who left, and who is sitting in an apartment she doesn't quite recognize as home yet, I see you. To the woman thinking about leaving, with a bag half packed in the back of a closet, I see you. To the woman who is married and just now, 3 minutes ago, realized what she has been carrying, I see you. To the woman who recognized herself in Sarah at the wash basin, I see you. Wherever you are in this, I see you. And you are not alone. Leave me a comment. Tell me what you felt listening to this. If there was one moment, one sentence, where you had to stop and put your hand on your chest, tell me what it was. I want to know. There is so much more I haven't said yet. I'm just getting started. There are stories I haven't been brave enough to tell about Sarah, about what came after the bishop's wife stood on my porch, about the day I packed my bag, but I'm getting closer. This is Rebecca Amish Home, and if you stay, I will keep telling them. And to the members and Super Chat family, you're the reason the next story gets told. If you want to be part of that, the door is always open. You were never the broken one. The silence was.